Right to be Read podcast, episode number 106, interview with Baron Hollins.
You are listening to the Right to be Read podcast, and this is your host, Ani Alexander.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Right to be Read podcast, the podcast that inspires and encourages writers. I'm your host, Ani Alexander, and as always, I would like to thank you for listening to the show and for spending this time with me. Today, we have yet another interview. Today, I'm going to talk to one of my online friends who I'm sure will bring in lots of insight and will also help you in building your audience and in making your book known. So, I'm talking to Baron Hollins today. Baron Hollins is a doctor from Britain who now works in Canada. He is planning to publish his first novel later this year, and with that in mind decided to commit to the idea of building an audience in advance. So he started the First 3 Chapters podcast, about which we are going to talk today, and which I'm sure will be a very good channel for your upcoming books. And to find out how and why, let's jump into the interview. Baron, I'm really happy to have you over. I'm kind of, it's always different when you interview people whom you knew before actually, inviting them for interviews. So, Baron is one of my online friends, and it's very nice to to play a small role in him becoming a podcaster as well. So welcome to the show, Baron.
Thank you, Annie. It's a real pleasure to be here. And yes, it's an odd situation to be interviewed on a show by somebody who you've kind of known for a while.
Yeah, it's a bit different, but I'm sure that it will be fun and we'll kind of enjoy it as well as our listeners will do.
Yes.
So let's start from the beginning. I mean, we sort of know each other, but those who listen don't. So let's just start from the beginning by letting people know who you are and what you are doing right now.
Yeah, well, I have been playing at writing books, I guess, for a long time. All my life, really, I always thought to myself, one day I'm going to have some novels published and I will be able to call myself an author. And in the past, I tried going down that traditional route of publishing. So a good few years ago now, I was writing a children's novel at that time, and I had got myself an agent, and it was being taken around all the children's publishing companies, and I got some good feedback from some of the companies. Walker's children's books were very interested in publishing it, but then nothing happened and it all fell apart, and I was quite despondent about it, and I almost gave up writing for a while then. But then in recent years, I guess as I was listening to podcasts, I really became aware of the whole self-publishing movement. And then I guess about a year ago, when I started listening to your podcast back when it first launched, you were bringing on all these people who were really successfully launching their books on Kindle and self-publishing, and I thought, well, this is something I've got to go and try. I really wanted to resurrect my writing at that stage, and so a lot of the people who were coming onto your show were suggesting trying to build your audience before you launch the book. And I know there's different opinions about that, but I thought, well, why don't I try and do that? Why don't I go and see if I can find a way to build an audience who might be receptive when I launch my first book, which will hopefully be later this year. So I decided to start a podcast, and it's a podcast that's all about other people's books, and it's been a lot of fun.
Okay, so let's start one by one and kind of I'm gonna follow your journey and try to understand how did you get up and ended up with the podcast and your plan to actually launch your book by the end of the year. So let's just start from the beginning. You went through the traditional route, and you had this pretty common disappointing effect from the traditional publishers and the agents.
Yes.
Which happened to me too. And so you mentioned something which is very important, and I would like to kind of, research a bit on that. Let's kind of understand when nothing happened with the traditional publishing and your children's novel, you said that you gave up writing for a while, and then you actually obviously continued writing because you're writing now. So can you explain what happened? I mean, why did you give up? Because you got rejected, or there was something else? And what made you restart writing?
Yeah, I felt pretty dejected about this novel. That at that time I'd probably put about 2 years of my life into writing that novel, getting it as good as I could, and going through that whole business of getting agents. And it's a very, very slow process of having them taking it round the different publishing houses, and it was, in the end, it was just kind of depressing. And although I never consciously gave up writing, I found after that happened, I probably went about a year where I hardly wrote a thing. But I still had that dream. I still always knew I saw myself as being an author. And so I thought I need to reinvigorate myself. So at that time I went and took a creative writing class. Just an evening class, and it was fantastic, and I really fell in love with writing again at that stage. Mm-hmm. And it's also in a way that class gave me some inspiration for what I do with my podcast, because one of the things that the lady who ran the class used to do was to take our work and read it aloud to the class. And hearing your writing and the words that you've written read by somebody else it's just amazing. It brings it to life in a way that's really hard to describe, and it suddenly makes the whole everything about the words you've written seem much more real. Hearing them being delivered by somebody else, and it definitely made me feel at that time like my words were worth writing, and the stuff I was writing was worth getting out into the world.
Okay, I see. Well, I mean, I'm very happy that kind of, the rejections you received from the traditional publishers did not really affect. I mean, they kind of made you slow down for a while, but they didn't really make you kind of doubt yourself as an author and, have this negative effect of not believing in your writing. So basically, that's really a good thing, because many kind of give up at that point just because they start believing that their writing is not good enough. Yeah.
And I can really understand how that would happen. And I think it nearly happened to me as well, but I was determined for that not to happen.
Okay, I see. So do you have any specific writing routines, or, what do you do in order to make sure that you produce at least a bit regularly?
Yeah. Well, I find, to be honest, the stories that I have in my head and the characters who are there are pretty vivid to me, and I'm carrying those stories around with me all the time. And there's a lot of the time they're just bursting to get onto paper. Now that's maybe that's something odd about me, but I know it's generally just a matter of time to find some time and sit down and write it. I don't find that sitting down every day and just writing for 15 minutes, say, really works for me terribly well. Because I find I have to really get into the zone with my writing, and for me that takes a few hours. So what I usually do is try and find a few hours a couple of times a week that I can fit around work. I do have a really busy job. It's very, very time demanding. And so I don't have lots of time every day for writing, but I can usually find a couple of times a week. Often a good time for me is really early on the mornings at the weekends. I just get up at the time I would usually get up for work, and I can get a few hours writing in before everybody else is up and about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. So let's move on. So you got back to writing. You took the creative writing course. You have all these stories which you carry with you, and whenever you have time, you put it on paper. You also have the plan of sharing your first book with the world. So let's talk about that. How did you decide? I mean, did you decide to self-publish just because the traditional publishing didn't work, or because you realized that, self-publishing really does work and it's possible to to become a famous author just by self-publishing?
Yeah, I think initially I went looking into it because it felt like the traditional publishing route hadn't worked out for me. But then as I started to learn more about self-publishing, I realized that actually it just makes so much more sense as a way to publish. I mean, you have all the creative control yourself. You're not asking somebody else to publish you. You're just making a decision to say, yeah, I've got this story and I want to give it to the world to read. And it's really not a difficult process to do that. Maybe it's difficult to get your book as good as it possibly can be before you do that. But anybody can self-publish. And so why wait on those traditional companies saying, yes, we will allow you to publish? It's very liberating to be able to just put out what you want to yourself.
Okay, I see. So how do you feel about, we've spoken a lot on this podcast about being emotionally prepared to kind of share your writing with the world, and being emotionally prepared for the feedback that you will eventually be receiving from readers. So, are you preparing yourself for that? And if yes, how?
Yeah, I think I've been preparing myself like that for quite a long time now. So initially, just I guess when I was first sending off work to traditionally publishing houses and to agents, you get quite used to rejection at that point. And so to be honest, that when you're doing that, any positive feedback that you get seems great, because most of the time you're just getting rejection letters. But also, if for somebody who's never really had other people reading their work, actually a really good thing to do is go to a creative writing class, because then you're constantly having your work read by other people, and that's a really supportive environment, and you can get a lot of good feedback from other people, or using. I know there's a lot of online writing groups that you could potentially use to get feedback from other writers. I will occasionally get feedback from family. I trust my wife as a reader. She's quite a good beta reader for me. So she tells me when things are good and when they're not good. So and I think that's really important, to have somebody who can do that for you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in my case, that doesn't really work, because I'm writing women's fiction, and my husband is not the perfect audience for that.
Yes.
But if it works in your case, then I guess it's great, because I know that for relatives it's a bit difficult to be brutally honest.
Yes.
And at that stage, that's exactly what we need, actually, because if whatever we write, they say it's very good and, everything is perfect. I mean, that's not really what we want to hear.
It's not much use, to be honest.
Yeah. So, if you manage to do that, then I guess that's the great part of, having someone you trust, being honest and with feedback, and you can kind of, work on that and continue developing your manuscript. So, okay, so you kind of heard my guests saying that you need to have an audience in place before you publish your book. Although, I also had guests which were kind of saying the opposite.
I know.
So you listened to those who said you need an audience and decided to go through that route. And what made you think, I mean, there are various ways of kind of growing an audience. You could have been blogging, most probably. You could have been active on social media and different groups and stuff like that. And the podcast is like something which not many authors are doing yet. So why did you decide to choose this channel?
Yeah, it's partly because I really enjoy podcasts, and there's a few podcasts that I listen to all the time. I first got into podcasts, interested in them, listening to Pat Flynn's podcast, and which is great and always a good listen. And so through listening to that, I'd always been kind of interested in the idea of having a podcast anyway. But yeah, when it came to choosing the way I was going to communicate to an audience, I thought very specifically the audience I want to get are people who like books, and who in particular who like fiction, and because I want them hopefully to enjoy my books in the end. And so I thought, how can I reach out to those people, and how can I deliver them some content that's interesting? So I thought, well, I would do a podcast that's featuring fiction, and a podcast just seems to be a nice, fun, immediate way of doing that. And I like telling stories. I've always liked reading aloud and the giving talks and that kind of thing. So a podcast felt like a natural way to do it, and easier to me than writing blog posts, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I can relate actually, because it's the same with me. Although I'm a writer and I kind of, I can write blog posts as well, but I don't enjoy that as much as kind of just talking on a mic. So, and I know actually I had the feeling that you launched your podcast quite fast. I mean, it didn't take you too long. I mean, how long did it take to launch your podcast?
It really just took a few weeks. I'm trying to think. I should have kept a diary of the whole process, but I think it took me about 4, maybe 6 weeks at the most. It took I guess in a way you were the big incentive for me to go and do a podcast in the end. I always religiously listened to your podcasts, and then you mentioned in your show doing the webinar about the podcast incubator.
Oh yeah.
With Miran Barakat. And that was the moment really when I said, yes, I'm going to do this now. I'd been thinking about it for a while. But getting that introduction to Miran was fantastic. That changed my life, I think, at that point.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it's amazing. You're saying this, and I'm like smiling from this side of the microphone, because when I was just starting with learning how to podcast, and when I, in the very beginning when I joined Podcast Incubator, I was like someone who had lots of doubts. I had no idea whether I could do it or not. I was like, even when everything was ready, I had a panic attack speaking to Miran, saying like, okay, everything is ready. I can launch even tomorrow. But what if I do that and no one will listen to me? So I was kind of, even when everything was ready, I was not ready to actually launch. So now saying that kind of, that my podcast has become incentive for you to start yours. It's kind of like, wow, who would have thought about this like about a year ago? I mean, I would never even dream about that, because I myself wasn't sure that I would do that. I wasn't sure that people would listen, because I had this feeling that if they wouldn't, and I would see that with the stats dashboard, knowing that I'm talking to myself, I most probably wouldn't have the motivation to carry on. And now looking back, I mean, a year has passed, and other people are kind of joining our community just because I did it. So it sounds really nice.
I know, and it's amazing, really, to think how far you can come in a year with something like a podcast.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I do believe, I mean, the reason I brought in Meron wasn't just because I knew that Podcast Incubator is really great in terms of, for someone to learn how to podcast and to launch a successful podcast, because, maybe that's not something people are interested in. But the main reason was because I believed that podcasting is a really nice way to gain audience as an author, because it's still new and there's still not too many people in there, so it's not very crowded, and the competition is relatively lower than the competition we have with bloggers and and the social media accounts, which already have big influential names out there against which you will be competing. So basically, I still believe that that's the best way up to now. I mean, most probably something else will be coming after this one, but at this point, I think this is the optimal way in terms of the time and effort, and in terms of the audience you can gain, and all these huge supports that iTunes is providing. I think that's like kind of really, really easy for writers to get into and to actually gain targeted audience in there.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your podcast, because we spoke about it a lot, but we never mentioned its name, which is like, it's the most common mistake I'm making, because I'm doing the same with authors. I'm talking about their books, and we end up mentioning the name somewhere in the middle, or sometimes even at the end. So let's start from the name and what it is about, actually.
Yeah. Well, I run the First Three Chapters podcast. And the reason I called it the First Three Chapters was because back in the bad old days, when you had to send samples of your work to publishing houses to see if you could get them published, you used to have to send the first three chapters of whatever book that you were writing. So, so I made it the First Three Chapters podcast. And it's a way for new writers to get their writing out to the world and their books out to the world. And so the way I've done it, I've set it up that I really want to help new authors and new writers get exposure for their books. So I'm not terribly interested in working with authors who are already massively successful. Mm-hmm. Really, I'm looking for people who are ideally indie authors who are just at that stage of putting out their first book or their first couple of books, and nobody maybe has heard of them, and they don't have an audience of their own at that stage. And so the way I structure the podcast is that I get their book and I read the first three chapters aloud to their audience. Like I say, I enjoy telling stories and I enjoy reading books. So for me, it's a lot of fun to make that as good a performance as I possibly can, and hopefully it then becomes a great way for new listeners and new readers to find out about that new book that's out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the listeners who are writing their book or have finished writing and publishing their books, I guess they know where they should go and they should approach Baron and ask to actually be featured on the First Three Chapters podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, that has started to happen now, which has always been my goal. I'm getting authors approaching me directly saying, I'd love you to feature my book on your show, which is brilliant. Partly because it saves me a huge amount of time, because otherwise I have to go trolling around, cold calling authors and saying, "Hi, I run a podcast. Do you think I could feature your book on my show?"
Oh yeah,
and sometimes I get really positive responses. Sometimes they just ignore me.
Yeah. Well, it happens. I mean, even if you're interviewing someone on a podcast, you get into the same situation, basically. But you said it's fantastic that authors are approaching you with their books and want to be featured. I would add a little but in there and saying like, okay, how do you choose? I mean, you may, and maybe you haven't been in this situation yet, but you may end up with some books which, mildly said, are not really of a good quality. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, to be honest, one of the things is that some books are just never going to sound good with my voice. There are just certain types of books. If for instance, the accent is really important, I'm not going to go putting on silly accents for it. And so some books just won't work in my voice. And some books I would say just aren't ready. And I think to be honest, I would feel it was my job if somebody came to me with a book that I didn't feel was really ready, maybe needed a little bit of work. I would probably give them that feedback in as nice a way as I could, because I think it's useful to get that feedback that maybe your work needs a bit more preparation or more editing to really have it ready. So I would say that, but for some books, it's just, as I say, it's just not going to work for me reading it aloud.
Okay. Now, when I'm like thinking about this, I've heard several of your episodes, and kind of it does sound like a professional audiobook, which makes me think that eventually you will end up receiving some offers to voice over an audiobook. Are you thinking about leveraging your podcast into that direction?
It's not something I ever thought about before, but I've had so much feedback from the audience, from the authors that I've worked with, who really love the audio of their books.
See? Yeah.
And so maybe I will. Maybe that's a route I'll just drift into at some point.
Yeah, I'm just wondering that instead of going to work, maybe you will just stay at home, record the books, and then, deal with your podcast and keep on writing.
I know. Maybe I will. Yes. Yeah. I guess I am fortunate because I do have a job that I love doing. So
in that case,
So and I guess I'm lucky that way, and not all of us are that lucky.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was just reading the statistics the other day, and it said like 70% of the US corporate workers hate their job, which is kind of a very scary percentage.
It is, isn't it?
It's like 70% of the corporate workers are not happy, which is kind of a really harsh kind of statement to make. Yeah. Okay. So we understood what writers are getting from that podcast. So did you have any feedback from the potential readers, the people who are listening to these fiction books? I mean, what is their reaction?
Yeah, I've been getting a lot of feedback from them. I guess when I tried to start the podcast, what I was trying to achieve is like a mini audiobook. And I know that people like to listen to audiobooks in their cars when they're commuting and that kind of thing. Or some people like to listen to them at bedtime before they go to sleep. And so I thought it's really important that if I'm going to do this, that it sounds as good as an audiobook so that people can enjoy the audio in that way and enjoy the story in that way, and might then be inclined to go on and buy the rest of the the book, and then that way the author who I'm working with really gets something useful out of it as well. And so, yeah, lots of people have been getting in touch and saying they really enjoy listening to the story being told to them. And so it's that's great feedback for me. It means that I'm on the right track. I do keep trying to improve the audio, and I'm sure one day I'm going to be feel inspired to set up a proper home studio here. But at the moment, with my simple little setup, I'm pretty pleased with the results I'm getting.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have a very simple setup as well myself. So I'm just having my laptop and my microphone, and it's quite flexible. It's good for me because, I mean, depending on the time of the day when I'm doing the interview, and I'm like, I'm super flexible. So I may be doing it anytime, basically, including 4 a.m. or 3 a.m. or whatever it is because of the time zones. So I can just pick those two up and go wherever it's convenient at that certain moment at home, and just close the door and make sure no one disturbs me. So in that sense, simple setup is, has its own advantages.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so let's briefly touch your upcoming books launch as well, since you're kind of you've set up a tentative date of having your first book out at the end of the year. Like, what book is it, and what are your plans in terms of launching it eventually?
Yeah, so the book I'm writing at the moment it's intended to be the first in a series of books, and it's a paranormal thriller, I would guess, that features werewolves, or a family of werewolves. And that's the kind of genre that I always enjoy reading and watching those kind of dramas and movies and things as well. So, I've had this story developing for quite a long time. So, I'm well into the process of writing the book at the moment. The first draft will be complete quite soon, and then I've got all the editing to do, and so I'm hoping to launch this one towards the end of the year. At this stage, because I haven't done this will be my first sort of indie launch, so I it's hard to be absolutely definite about the timelines, but I've definitely got a goal by the end of the year. This book will be out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see. So what are you planning to, once the book is ready, how are you going to deal with, I mean, first of all, how have you decided to deal with all these things that need to be done to the manuscript before it becomes a book? And once it's published, what are you planning in terms of promotion?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I do is I guess I'm keeping my listeners on the podcast up to date with the fact that I'm a writer as well, and that I'll be launching later this year, just so that they know. And I did a little teaser of my writing in a podcast episode a couple of weeks ago, where I read some of my own writing. Which I got some good feedback on as well. So hopefully my audience are already beginning to be aware that I'm going to have a book coming out. And at that stage, when I am ready to launch, I will probably give my audience the opportunity to become early readers, with the view to be able to have them get reviews on Amazon at the point that I launch. So taking some ideas from people I've listened to on your show, and and so we'll see how that goes. I'm definitely going to need help with the whole putting the manuscript together and formatting it properly and getting covers designed and all that kind of thing, because that's all going to be new for me, and I definitely don't really know what I'm doing.
Okay, I see. Well, I mean, there are kind of so many options out there. So I'm sure you have a big choice depending on your resources and on what you exactly need. There are many, many places to go to and kind of investigate and research and see, what you need exactly.
Yeah.
Because I have a feeling, although for both fiction and non-fiction, it's very crucial, but I have a feeling that the editing of the fiction books is like the most problematic, most expensive and most important part of this process.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, because I have met many good and affordable at the same time editors for non-fiction, which is not the case for fiction yet.
No. Yeah, I know. I'm anticipating that and getting the right book cover as well, being the big costs and the big investments, I think, in the long run. And I do think you have to see these things as an investment, so that you're not immediately going to turn off readers with bad grammar and bad spelling.
Oh, yeah, that's true. And why I said that for fiction it's more important, because I have a feeling then that while editing fiction, it's not only the grammar and the spelling that needs to be kind of, edited.
Yes.
And you get a more detailed and more deep editing advice from the editor rather than just kind of going through the mistakes and making sure they're correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, I have a feeling that you have a plan in place. You're kind of doing the right things. You're already like in a place to grow an audience where not many are. So you're like already few steps ahead of other authors who haven't yet started a podcast. And also I guess since we cover, you've been listening to many podcasts and knowing all those self-publishing podcasts out there and how much they have covered up to now and how many different advices they have been given through their guests. I'm sure you have this big baggage of things that you already know by this time.
Yes. Yes, I know. I'm an avid listener to all of that stuff.
Oh yeah. So basically, let's just before we wrap up, tell my listeners how they can find you, how they can find your podcast, and what they should present you about their book so they get featured.
Yeah. Well, my podcast is available on iTunes. So it's the First Three Chapters podcast. And just look that up on iTunes and you'll find it there. But I've also got a website, thefirst3chapters.com, or you can find me on Facebook at the First Three Chapters podcast. So quite a few different ways you can find me, and you can get in touch with me through the webcast, through the website or on Facebook. And I thought today I'd love to give your listeners the chance to have some of their writing featured. And so if anybody has maybe even a short story or the first three chapters of a novel that they've had in the drawer and they've been thinking about publishing but have just never really taken it out of the box yet, I'd love to see that stuff. And if people get in touch and send me some of that along, I'll feature some of the best things on the show. And as I say, it doesn't need to be a full novel. If somebody's got a nice short story, I'd just as happily do that. And it could be a great way to get some of your writing out there and get some feedback on it.
Oh, great. By the way, I didn't know about this. This is a surprise for me too. But I think that it's a great way. If there are people listening out there who have written something but are not yet ready to share it with the world and to go ahead and publish it, or who never had the chance of having people who don't know them kind of find out about this and provide feedback, maybe this way can be the first step towards a bigger steps out there, and maybe doing this will be easier for you, and this is where you can start.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's great. And at some point, I guess I would like to be featured as well, because, when you mentioned that you periodically remind your listeners that you're an author too, well, I don't do that. So I have to, so there is at least one thing I have to learn from you, and we'll go from there. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure that, it will interest most of the guys out there, because I'm sure after 1 year of podcasting that most of my writer listeners, who even those who haven't been writing, I've been talking about this so much that at least they have started. So yeah. I'm sure there are many people out there who have lots of amazing stories in the drawers, or, preparing to be published, or, in different stages. And I'm sure that they will really appreciate the chance of being featured on the podcast.
Well, thanks, Sani. It was great to get the chance to be on the show.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Have a nice day.
You too.
Well, I guess that was it for today. I would like also to mention that few days after we recorded this interview with Baron actually read the first 3 chapters of my very first novel, High Fall, in his podcast. And I'll include the link in the show notes at www.anialexander.com/106. And actually, yes, I totally agree, and I totally understand now what Baron meant when he said that the writing kind of comes alive and becomes more real when it's read and when you listen to it. It was a completely different experience. Listening to my writing made it very different. It was very interesting to listen to it, and sometimes at some points I even had a feeling that it was someone else's work. So actually, what I wanted to say here was that it's really very interesting and unique thing that can happen to your writing. So I would encourage you to just give it a chance and to give the first 3 chapters of your book to Baron and see what happens. He's a really great narrator. You can check him out, and I'm sure that your book will only gain from it. Well, I guess I don't have anything much to add up to this. Just as always, encouragement and inspiration from me to you. Keep writing, don't stop. Believe in yourself. And, as always, I truly believe that you are a writer, so you should believe in that too. Take care.